Shade, Chapter 1. Rain was not given to panic. Granted, when she had become suspicious that the shadows grouped uncannily like a man in the back of her garden actually were a man, perhaps she should have taken more action than observation, yet she hadn't. In sincerity, she wasn't convinced that the man was real. As she looked through the sheer blue curtains wafting in the night breeze, they looked more like a statue than a man, except for the slight ruffle of hair. She stood back from the window, certain he couldn't see her. When she'd first noticed, after putting on her pajamas and turning out the light, it had been slightly past 10. She'd glanced out the window and seen a lump of shadows. They had looked a little like a person, standing at the back of her garden toward the far edge of the yard. She'd startled and ducked behind the edge of the window. When she peeked out again, the haphazard shadows seemed even less defined, a trick of the darkness and her own tired mind. Her head was a throbbing mass of nerves, and she went to get something for it. When she returned to her room, she looked again. The shadows looked more human this time, but blended with the backdrop of night, like a sketch in chalk pastels, smudged at the edges and fading. She could not get the shadows to focus correctly. She stood staring for almost an hour, her feet tingling with the pooling blood, her knees growing stiff. The shadow had not stirred. The longer she looked, the more shadows seemed a little more solid, more separate from their surroundings. By the time she remembered that she was holding 2 aspirins, slowly dissolving in the sweat of her palm, she was almost certain that the shadow was a man, one foot threatening her tomatoes, the other encroaching upon her nicely ripening squash. She could make out a little of his face, but only some slight variations of light and shadow that hinted at the placement of eyes, nose, and edge of his mouth. Rain put a cupped hand to her mouth, depositing the 3 aspirins which were supposedly made for migraines. They never seemed to help much. The headaches had been getting worse, and she grimaced at the mixture of chalky and bitter that lingered in the back of her throat even when she washed the pills down. The past few nights had held a sleepless vibrancy, lights too bright after sunset, television too loud. She thought of calling the police, but something about the form didn't seem real. With the lack of sleep and the migraine auras, her fear of the threat being only in her mind gave her reason to hesitate. The garden was a good distance away, far enough that she still might be mistaken. Even as she watched, the figure seemed to waver and separate into bits of shadow. "This is ridiculous," Rain said, closing her eyes. When she opened them, he was gone. Her gaze searched the yard, and she put her face up to the screen to look as far as possible to both sides. But nothing. She took a deep breath and blew it out slowly, turned and walked down the hall to the bathroom. Sky blue towel, peach tiles, white sink, hazy mirror. Behind a soft veil of spots on the bathroom mirror, Rain saw her own visage looking back at her. She turned on the tap and splashed her face a few times. The water was a soft blessing with a chlorinated halo. A swipe or two across the mirror with the now damp towel, and her image became more crisp. She could feel already that the aspirins were no match for the migraine. It was like David showing up without his slingshot, Goliath towering over him, laughing before lifting a foot to bring it down, shaking the earth, and leaving the would-be hero flattened against the mid-eastern desert. Rain leaned against the white shape of the sink, closing her eyes. She had to get her thoughts in order, collect her wits. Walk into her bedroom, the soft carpet muffling her steps. She ran a hand along the wall in the dark as she padded down the hallway. Without flipping the lights on, she crept toward the window in her room. Behind her garden, a newly mown hayfield shone like a lake of silver in the moonlight. The long piles of grasses lay drying in preparation for being gathered up and baled to become feed for some farmer's livestock. Beyond the field lay a modest forest, dense enough that the other side could not be seen. Crickets and night creatures in hidden places sent up their song to the night sky, fervent and chaotic, as if they knew the first frost was not long ahead. The man-shadows were still gone. Over an hour earlier, Rain had brewed a pot of tea. It would be cool enough to drink by now, and then some. So she turned away from the window and crossed the bedroom, stepping carefully over a mound of clothes waiting to be washed. Some nights, when she had been a young girl, Rain crept down the hallway to find her mother pouring tea in the kitchen, just as Rain herself was now doing. Her mother would take the tea onto the patio and savor it in the dark evening. Rain would follow. They wouldn't talk, they just sat and enjoyed the evening. The memory of these nights clung to her mind as she took her lukewarm cup to the patio door and looked out. The living room was dark. There was no way she could be seen inside the house. But when she looked out the patio, the man's shadow was standing at the edge of the stones, less than 10 feet away, looking at her. Rain stifled a scream and dropped her cup. It fell to the floor, bounced, and a splash of dark tea spread against the tanned carpet at her feet. Her body was shot with ice, adrenaline pumping and knotting her stomach in an instant. Amid the cadence of nocturnal insects and nighttime creatures, the only sound that existed to her was the pounding of her heart. She backed away from the window and bumped into an end table, knocking the phone from its cradle. She groped blindly for it, her eyes still glued to the patio door. As she felt the phone's keypad beneath her fingers, she glanced down and dialed 911. After a moment that stretched into the realms of infinity, a woman answered on the other end and asked her which department she needed, fire, police, or ambulance. Rain's mind struggled to remember what each word meant and how it applied to her at that moment. "Police," she whispered hoarsely. There was a pause, and the woman asked her what was happening. "There's a man outside my back door," Rain said. "Ma'am? What's your address?" Rain felt like her memory had been erased. She hadn't had this much trouble coming up with answers since her college exams. She began to speak, and the numbers rolled off her tongue of their own accord. "Is he armed?" the woman on the phone asked. "I don't know," Rain said, craning her neck to look outside. Again, he was gone. As her mind tried to wrap around the possibility, or more accurately, the likelihood, that he hadn't existed at all, she hung up the phone and stood staring at the door. On tiptoes she walked to it and looked out. There was no sign of him. She looked as far to the right and to the left as she could through the panes, but there was still nothing to hint that he'd ever been there at all. "It's only my mind playing tricks. He's just an illusion. It's not real," she said to herself, repeating it several times like a mantra of sanity. She thought about it for a while as she stood in the dark living room and decided that maybe insanity was better. She walked quickly down the hall to her bedroom and shut the door, cutting the world off. She felt a little safer. Not much, but beggars can't be choosers, especially when the beggar is home alone at night, with a mysterious disappearing stalker in the backyard. Framed photographs of European crop circles, taken from calendars, were hung around the room. The green and gold images stood out in contrast against the muted blue walls. A small wooden desk with a pull-out workspace sat in one corner. Within it were art supplies, a drawer crammed with the bevy of pens and mechanical pencils, and another larger drawer where she kept a number of black and white composition books. A tall bookshelf stretched from floor to ceiling beside the desk. Her grandfather had made the bookshelf by hand and given it to her for her 12th birthday. Rain had already gathered enough books to fill nearly all of the shelves to capacity, and would likely need a new bookshelf after the few more trips to Hyde Brothers bookstores. A large print of Circe Invidiosa by Waterhouse hung over the bed, Circe forever pouring her bowl of poison into the sea. Rain's bed, still made from that morning, was host to several novels she'd been reading simultaneously in her spare moments. She gathered them from their comfortable resting place and put them in one of the less crowded shelves of the bookcase. The books on the shelves had become disorganized, and Rain resisted the urge to begin placing them in order of subject and genre, in decreasing size from left to right, as she often did when she wanted to busy her mind for a while. Rain looked again out the window and across the still empty yard. She blinked her eyes a few times, took several breaths, and lay down on the bed. She curled her on her side and hugged her pillow tightly, listening for any out-of-place sounds.